Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed.
And I love the way that he says it the same way every time.
Every time.
That's a podcast pro right there. Like every time. Every time I sort of want to just jump in and say it right along with him, just.
He'll still get it right.
Every time.
Welcome back to another week of Formed.
I don't even think about it.
That's a pro right there. That's a pro.
It's kind of like how I used to do the vision statement. Like he's got the hand movement, everything. He's got that. Yeah.
Brian has his ticks. You all have your things.
Yeah.
I love it.
Today, we're going to talk about church hopping.
Oh, boy.
Just hopping to church.
Yep.
Now, I was reading on Relevant Magazine, there was a recent article about church hopping and the need. And they're like, is this a sign for a deeper spiritual, I don't know, not growth, but like need or desire? Mm-hmm. And, I just think about times in my life when, we first moved to Dallas and it's like, well, what, we moved here for...
Looking for a church.
Looking for a church and moved here for DTS. And then it was like, well, what in the world? There's a million churches in Dallas. And it's like, we're trying, we came from a small town. So it's like, let's try here, try here. And then at some point we were like, how long are we going to do this hopping around here?
Yep.
I feel like we have to pick a home at some point.
Yeah.
And it's kind of stressful. It's kind of like all that stuff. So I guess I don't know when the last time for you guys, as far as like not having like a role in a church that you're just going to go to it and commit to it without having a role to it. But if you think about the process of landing on a church, what do you even think about in that process? Where does your mind go to?
Yeah, I think I'd start with us when I thought about the question is there's no perfect church. That's part of it, right? There, like if you're looking for a perfect church, we're just not going to find it. I think as you think about, if you're looking for a church, I think it's important to recognize that we're called to be active participants and not just consumers. Especially in our culture, I think we can easily fall into that tendency to have sort of that consumer mentality. But I do think there are at least a few things I thought about that I would look for in church. So first of all, biblical faithfulness to teaching and worship. So is the church, proclaiming the truth of the gospel? Is it grounded in Jesus, as we talk about here? Does it have a kind of worship? Does it offer a kind of worship that engages the heart and the soul and the mind and brings you deeper into the presence of God? Does it practice the sacraments? I think that's really important that we practice the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. I think that's core to our faith. So biblical faithfulness, I think, is one. And then I think secondly, I would say, does it have opportunities and space for community and discipleship? We are certainly transformed when you're, worshiping together and you hear the truth of the gospel proclaimed to you through the preaching of the word. But there is also transformation that takes place as we're in community together, as again, we've been talking about here. As we do life with one another, as we pursue Jesus together. And so does the church have opportunities for that? Are people growing in their faith through in relationships with one another? So I think that's the second thing I'd say. And then thirdly, does it have a missional focus and is it engaging the culture? So we want to be transformed, but as we often say, not just for ourselves, but for the world around us. So that means both our local community, our global community. And then when you even think about that, God's heart is for justice. And so does the church stand up for the rights of the poor and the marginalized, the oppressed? And how does a church do that? And then I think what's also important is that idea of cultural engagement, that sometimes you can find places where churches retreat from the culture. And then you can find places that maybe they're consuming the culture more than you might think is appropriate. And so is there a healthy way of engaging the culture in truth and grace? So I think that's really important as well.
That's good.
And I think finally, I would just kind of think about, are there opportunities for me to grow and to use my gifts here? That doesn't mean it's about my personal preference necessarily, but are there opportunities to do that?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, it's so I love where you began to see that, just the recognition that there's always going to be a gap that exists between sort of the ideal church that exists really only in one's head and the reality of the churches that we find. And I mean, the three of us are in leadership at a church that we all love and think is great. Yeah. And there's probably still a sense in which there's a gap between the sort of ideal and the reality that we encounter. So that just is the way it is, right? That's called reality.
Yeah.
And so the issue becomes, what kind of gap can you live with? And so I love I think the criterion that you pointed to are really important. And my mind went to, I didn't necessarily do it on purpose, but there are 3 D words that came to my mind of doctrine, discipleship, and distance. Deeper. So doctrine, is there a sense of theological alignment?
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you have to agree on every minute sort of point of theology. Within the life of this church, there's all kinds of, I think, theological differences. We talk about the room for liberty on those kind of secondary issues, but at a core level, are we in doctrinal alignment? Discipleship, is there an opportunity for me really to learn and to grow here, to be discipled in the way of Jesus, which I think then, again, according to my way of thinking about discipleship, implies the idea of mission, that we're engaged in the world around us, we're making a difference in our community. And then one thing that I think is important is distance, that we live in a world, especially here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, that we're so, our lives are so stretched out. And it's not that that's sort of an absolute thing. I mean, when we first came to IBC, we were living a pretty good distance away. But one of the things that we experienced even early on when I started on the preaching team is that, our closest friends in the church lived the opposite direction of the church that we did. And so while we were, 15 to 20 minutes away going one direction, they were 15 to 20 minutes away going the other direction. And it just made our ability to actually be in community together really complicated, right? And so again, it's not an absolute thing, but I think if there are churches that are close to you in proximity, that there's doctrinal alignment, there's opportunities for discipleship, there's making a difference in the community, then to engage with a place that helps your life not be stretched so thin. So you mentioned, Isaac, the last time, it's been a while since I was not on staff at the church that we were a part of, but there was a point at which Kim and I, when I was working on my PhD and we were living outside of Chicago, we chose to go to a church that, look, it wasn't necessarily the worship that we loved or the preaching that we loved, but it wasn't about our preferences. It was actually about, this is a church that's close to where we live, that aligns with us theologically, where we can actually get really connected in community. I think that is an element when people are considering, is there a place where you actually already have some relationships? That, I think, should be a factor that weighs into it. Again, our story of first coming to IBC, before I was in any leadership role, we had some friends who were here. And we knew this church. We loved this church. We had encouraged people to come to this church. And we're like, wait a second. Some of our closest friends are going there. It's a little further for us, but let's go ahead and make that commitment and make this our home, where we can really get rooted in relationships. We can engage in the process of discipleship. We can make a difference in the community around us.
That's good. Yeah.
So when you look at the kind of the, let's say stressful sometimes, the process of trying to pick a church, and you're visiting different churches, you go on the website, you look at social media and all this stuff. I think there's a difference between visiting and trying out some churches and the term church hopping. To where hey, you go to a church, you commit to church for a year or so, and it's I'm gonna go commit to another church after that for a year or so, and then you're kind of hopping around in these different what's dangerous about that term, church hopping?
Well, to me, there's two very sort of close, not only close sounding, but close meaning terms there: church hopping and church shopping, right? And even the person who is oftentimes that idea of I'm trying to find a church, it gets presented as church shopping. And that really is a way of thinking about trying to find a church that's primarily about sort of what do I get out of it, right? It really becomes this kind of consumer mindset, and we're in this cultural environment so shaped to think, what do I get out of it? And rather than recognizing part of determining a church is what can I give to it, right? It's not just that the church I need something from the church, but actually I have a contribution to make. And so looking for what that contribution might be. And so the same thing then with church hopping is oftentimes somebody who's kind of hopping from one place to another is doing so motivated more out of a sense of personal preference and therefore what do I get out of it, rather than some sense of like, I have a contribution to make. If I stay rooted in this place over a long period of time, I'm going to get more from the experience, but I'm also going to be contributing to this body, to these people that I'm in community with. And that kind of real change in our lives and in the lives of other people that we get to be a part of happens through rugged commitment over the long haul.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I mean, to your point, Barry, one of the dangers is that you can tend to treat the church like it's a good to be consumed rather than a community to be a part of. And so it becomes about your preferences. I don't like the music style. That preacher doesn't really connect with me.
Sissy's pants are weird.
Yeah, that's like, I don't like her and whatever, right? And it's not the right programming and all of that. So it really becomes about my own comfort, my own preferences, rather than, is this a place where I can grow, and this is a place where I can actively participate and contribute. So I think that's an important danger. And then I think secondly, you can oftentimes, and I've seen this happen so many times, avoid discomfort. And so something happens, you're challenged, or relationship conflict occurs, and what's the first thing you do? You can either decide to stay, and it's that rugged commitment, or I'll just go to the church around the corner, right? There's another place I can go. And that, when you do that, when you avoid that kind of discomfort, many times you're missing out on growth, right? It's an opportunity for spiritual formation.
Shortchanging an opportunity for spiritual formation.
Yeah.
Both yours and perhaps
that
of the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think of that idea of rugged commitment over the long haul. We've got a family in our church. We have several families in our church, but one that comes to my mind is the Fannings. And they're this amazing couple that have just been committed to this church over decades. And they have seen this church go through all kinds of changes, some of which they probably loved, and some of which they probably didn't.
Yeah.
And yet they have just been so faithful to be a part of what God's been doing in this church. And so they've ended up making a huge impact on the lives of other people through that idea of rugged commitment over the long haul. That it wasn't that they just were here because of what they get out of it, but they were really making a significant contribution to the life of this church family over the course of decades now.
And that involves investment and sacrifice and discomfort oftentimes. And I think that's really important. And so I think that is a second danger. And then along with that comes when you church hop is you really are only able to develop shallow relationships because you're not in one place long enough to be really known. Nobody really knows your hopes and dreams and what you're struggling with. You can't really be vulnerable with somebody because you haven't been there long enough. And so there's that lack of depth in relationships that then makes it hard to find genuine community.
Yeah, to really have a place to be vulnerable, to have a place or people to whom you are accountable.
Yep.
I was just talking with the Fannings on Sunday, and we were talking about one of our global mission partners, and Christian in Romania, and so I was just asking about their relationships and stuff, and he just like lit up, and he's like, "Man, this is taking me back to the '90s," and thinking about that, and I'm like, "Oh, I was like 3," and and he's just talking about Sunday school and stuff, and love the Fannings, and okay, so. Let's say, and I think you kind of answered this in this last question, but like, I'm going to church. I'm here on Sunday mornings, worship. I love the message. I go home. Isn't that enough? What's the issue with that? I think sometimes is there an issue with just the Sunday morning? This is my commitment to the church, and bam, yeah. I
mean, certainly you can grow through hearing the scripture proclaimed, the truth of God's word proclaimed through preaching and through worship. That definitely happens. Transformation happens in that room. But I think you're robbing yourself of greater opportunities for growth because you're not engaging in that in that community and discipleship aspect that is so necessary for spiritual formation. So there isn't the accountability. You could show up or you could not show up. It's a big enough room probably in many places that no one's really going to know. You don't have to invest in other people. You don't have to be challenged by someone who's different than you. The one thing that I both love about church and that I think can be frustrating is like, there are people here that you don't always connect with that are different than you, that probably frustrate you. And that's actually good for us. And so if all you're doing is listening to a podcast or showing up on a Sunday morning in that large room experience, that's good, but I think you're missing out.
Yeah. The New Testament talks about this concept of koinonia.
Yeah.
Gets translated as fellowship. And of course, I grew up in
Go, Dr. Jones.
This church where we had the fellowship hall, right? And that was just kind of the place where we had potluck suppers and that sort of thing. And so I think I grew up with a kind of shallow understanding of what real fellowship was all about. But you look at this concept in the New Testament, and it's something that is really deep and rich in that sense of interconnected lives, a sense of partnership together. And that, I believe, is kind of the ideal that the New Testament calls us toward, that, yes, there can be something really good and meaningful about coming into that large circle, that public space of corporate worship, but you can only grow so far. And that I believe God's desire for us is then to move into those smaller circles. We talked about a few weeks ago, the circles of belonging, where identity formation takes place in the public space, that largest circle, the social space, as we step into a greater sense of, here's an opportunity for me to actually get to know some other people, to really get to know more and more about what this church is all about. But then to move from that social space into a more personal space where now we're actually kind of sharing life together, and then ultimately moving into that sense of intimate space where this is really where we are practicing vulnerability, where we're really sharing in depth what's going on in our lives and our souls and our struggles, and we're really able to encourage and support one another in that kind of way. And so, we're missing out on an opportunity for growth, for healing, for transformation to take place in our lives if we're not moving more deeply into those kinds of deep New Testament koinonia, that sense of connection, fellowship.
Throughout the New Testament, I would just add, throughout the New Testament, there's the command to one another, right? Bear one another's burdens, love one another, serve one another, honor one another. There's 70-some of those commands. You can't do that in a room of 1,000 people, right? You've got to be in the smaller circles to be able to do that kind of relationship. And so I think that's what we miss out on. Yeah.
It was cool on Sunday. If you're newer to IBC, we on our baptism Sundays, we have some testimonies that's kind of shown in service, and we filmed some of those this past Sunday. And just hearing one of these guys was like, "Yeah, man, I visited for a few months, and then I decided to dive in." And it's like dive in, that commitment. And what do you think is so hard sometimes for us to commit to a church?
Yeah. That's a good question. I do think that church hurt is a very real thing, and so there's some people who have experienced hurt in the church. What unfortunately can sometimes happen is we associate that hurt with the church as opposed to the people in that church who really hurt me. And so that it can actually then become a barrier. But the reality is that it's true that some of our deepest hurts come in the context of relationships. And yet I also believe that it's true that our deepest healing comes in the context of relationships as well. And so, but we can find ourselves having experienced some kind of hurt in a relationship, and it keeps us from wanting to kind of take the risk of vulnerability, the risk of moving more deeply into community, because I don't want to be hurt like that again. So that's definitely one that kind of comes to front of mind for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about it a little bit already, but I think as a culture, particularly in our Western culture, we prioritize individualism and consumerism and our own preferences over that idea of investing in this kind of long-term community, because it's hard, right? It requires time and effort and sacrifice and accountability, and none of us want to be accountable to other people. That's difficult work, and so I think that's part of it. I think there is also a fear of being hurt rejected or abandoned in a sense. Like if I really do go in, what's going to happen when something goes bad? So I think there's that. And then I just think, especially today, and I'm sure this was always true, but I think it's true today. I think about just the average family, that our lives are so fast paced and busy. And busy isn't necessarily wrong. Jesus was busy, but that our priorities sometimes get out of whack, right? So I think about the average family. Parents have jobs and careers and social obligations, but then kids have so many activities and sports and all this that they're also doing, that you kind of just get things out of whack, where being part of a community like this and understanding that's such an integral part of your spiritual formation takes a back seat to all these other things.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that we just do live such busy lives. We're pulled in so many different directions. We have so many kind of commitments and obligations that it can wind up crowding out our deep investment in the life of the church and the life of community. And so, that we've got to make sure that we're carving out, making space, making that a priority. And I even think, Isaac, where you guys are in the life of your family right now with little kids, like, it can be hard to navigate both your own family dynamics and then the family dynamics of other people. It's like, okay, what are we all going to do with our kids to get together, and how are we going to have a small group with all these kids running around? And so those can be very real challenges, but it takes that sense of, okay, but this is important, and so we got to figure something out to be able to really be in deep relationship with people that we're doing church with.
I feel like when I was smaller, like, there were no practices for anything on Wednesday nights or like Sundays at all. And now, I mean, Wednesday night's just a joke, like, as far as like people will schedule stuff for that. And now it's like, it blows me away when it's like, oh, we have a soccer tournament Sunday morning at 8, and it's like, what? But that, that's to, the commitments of all these other things and busy schedules. And okay, so let's do one question of, at some point, you might reach a point to where it's time for you to switch churches. When do you know that it's that point?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think, if the church has in some way drifted away from biblical teaching, if there's some kind of theological drift going on, the core tenets of Christianity, the core doctrine, I think that is certainly a reason why you might switch. I think if there's, and this is where you have to use a lot of wisdom and discernment, and I would even say wise counsel. But if there's a pattern of abuse and corruption in the leadership of the church, and there really aren't structures of accountability, and again and again we have seen that sort of thing happen, I think that is a time where you got to think about, is this the right place for me? And then then the other thing I would say is, is there toxic culture? And that's an important part of that. I think some of that is leadership. Some of that could be some other dynamics that are going on in the church. And then finally, is this a place where I can use my gifts? And that's not always, it doesn't mean, well, I didn't get this position in the ministry that I wanted. That's not necessarily a reason to leave the church. But can you, for the long term, are there opportunities for you to really use your gifts? I specifically think of women in the church, and there aren't a whole lot of churches where women are really given those opportunities to use some of the gifts that, in some ways, that many women are gifted. And so that's one thing that just kind of sticks out to me. But I do think you have to be really careful and very discerning, because it shouldn't be based on, I want to avoid a conflict, so I'm going to leave. I want they don't do my kind of music, and so I'll just go to the other church. So not making it based on personal preference or avoiding conflict or something like that, but really, is God calling you to another church because of something that's going on
that
here?
That guy wore a hat.
Or that,
I think the specific criteria that you mentioned are all spot on, very much in alignment with what I would say in response to this. I think that for me, the overarching thing is kind of, as you were getting there at the end, it's just as something that should not be taken lightly. And so if it's about a theological disagreement, boy, this should be a really important, really significant kind of theological disagreement, not something that's very much a secondary or tertiary kind of issue. Because you've been a part of this family. And so there really is a sense in which this is kind of a break in family. And so it just is something that should not be taken lightly. I do think it's something that should be communicated. I know that for myself as a pastor, when there's people that leave, there's sometimes that people leave and they, make a point to reach out to me and can we sit together and talk about it, or even write a letter and let me know. And there are times where we're actually able to have a conversation and realize, you know what, maybe there's a misunderstanding or something that we can actually repair here, and you can stay and we can continue moving forward together. And sometimes there's a recognition that, no, we are in different places and it probably is appropriate. And you can sort of move on to the next chapter with a sense of mutual blessing to one another. I think about one family in particular that I loved this family. I grieved their departure, but it was that recognition together that, this is probably the right thing. And so we love you. We're going to send you on your way. You're always welcome back here if you want to come back at some point. But what particularly grieves me is when there's especially long-time committed people that just sort of disappear.
Yeah.
And that oftentimes kind of leaves me wondering what happened. And part of the grief for me is I feel a sense of responsibility. Like this, I know this had to be really hard for you. You've been here a long time. You've been committed a long time. And so I know this was a painful decision for you, but I'd love to know what were the factors that led to that decision. If there is an opportunity for us to communicate about it, even if at the end of the day, there is a recognition, a mutual recognition, maybe moving on is the right thing to do. I would love at least to not have that departure that there is no communication kind of on our end. We're left wondering like,
what happened?
Why did they leave? What happened there? So shouldn't be taken lightly. And I think there are ways to do that, make that decision and communicate in healthy kinds of ways.
Yeah, I love that. And as you were talking, I was like, please do that.
Yeah.
If you have a question about that or you're thinking about that, have that conversation with us, because to your point, sometimes it is the right move and we can say, you know what, that is the best thing for you. And we're so excited to see what God does in this next season for you. Or it could be there was just something that we didn't properly communicate or something that's been miscommunicated. We can talk about that, or a hurt that we need
or something they heard and it's not even like true or something else.
It's lots of things. So that communication is so important.
Making that decision's hard. Picking a church is hard. And hopefully this can be an episode that maybe you can send to someone. Maybe this is yourself. That is, obviously we would love you at IBC. But this is like, hey, what should I look for in a church? This is an episode. If someone's asking that in your life, you can shoot them this episode and like, hey, this is what I think you should be looking for when you're trying to find a church and committing to a church and all of that. Yeah. So, all right. At the end of each episode, we have some banter. We have some fun. I've been heartbroken over the past, I don't know, 72 hours. In Dallas, Mavericks, they traded their superstar out of nowhere. Luka Doncic is gone.
Generational talent.
Yeah.
Generational talent.
Dallas is in mourning.
It's just, it's tough. And so it made me think about, for our banter today, what is a sports, what I shot to was, what is a sports movie slash TV show, pop culture heartbreak that just really, really got you?
I texted Isaac about the Luka Doncic trade just to say, I'm only a tiny fraction of the Mavs fan that I know he is. Yeah. And I was so depressed about this on Sunday afternoon. Like, I was just and I'm reading all this stuff and I'm just so upset. And I'm like, man, that has to be even that much more I just know what a fan, Isaac is, both of Luka and of the Mavericks. And so I don't know. I definitely was thinking about the fact that, MFFL,
Let's clip that.
Mavs fan for life. And I think probably had some people questioning that FL at the end, right?
That's the slogan, for the fan base. And it's like the irony. And Luka had his press conference in LA today, and he's just, talking about how emotionally hard it's been for him. And he was about to close on a house here in Dallas at the end of the month. And
it's crazy.
A new one, and no more.
Wow. So did you have a heartbreak?
I think yours is better. Mine's not really heartbreak. It's more disappointment. So I don't feel like mine's really.
It's like a celebrity couple.
No, it's not even that. It's not even that. Mine's not really good at all. It was just the first thing I thought of. But
J-Lo and Ben Affleck.
no, it wasn't. Okay, I'm
Which
just gonna say it
time?
now because you guys are guessing things I'd never do. All right. So I remember watching Lost, and like I was committed. I was so committed.
No,
like
there
we
was
had
lot
like
of people
and we had like this like weekly email thread that we'd like think about like what's going on, and we'd spend so much time talking about this show for 6 seasons, and then it ended, and I was like, I wasted so much of my life, so much of my life for this show that I don't even understand. So that was like my, like I just can't commit to a show like that anymore, and so that was my disappointment. So that was mine. That's the first thing I thought of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mine was Texas Rangers World Series with 2011 Game 6. Oh, that was just gut-wrenching. So I grew up as a little kid going out to the Arlington Stadium with my dad watching the Rangers. And so now I'm a dad, my own, and my oldest was old enough to, be interested in baseball. So we were watching games together. I taught him how to score a baseball game the old-fashioned
awesome.
way. And so we went to Game 5. And it was just this amazing experience. The Rangers come back, win Game 5, send it to Game 6. If we win Game 6, we win the World Series. I mean, I cried when the Rangers went to the World Series when they got in.
Yeah.
And so then we're watching Game 6, and we were one strike away, or one out away, right? One strike away, and it all fell apart. And then the Rangers went on to lose Game 7, and
That was it.
Yeah, but Game 6 was just gut-wrenching.
It's the closest you can possibly be to.
Yeah. I will say, when you mention movies and pop culture, the Star Wars prequels, particularly seeing The Phantom Menace for the first time, like I had grown up such a huge Star Wars fan. And like the original plan, they were coming out every 4 years. So I remember as a kid, like calculating how old I would be if they came out every 4 years, how long I would have to wait to see. And then we went all those years without another Star Wars film. And then here it comes. We're going back and we're doing and it was.
Wait, go back to where you calculated how old you were going to be.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
you did.
Yeah, for sure. So because
is
it was
great.
like 76,
Yeah.
80, 84 was Return of the Jedi. And so if you add 4 years for
Right.
each one, and they were going to do 9 movies,
Yeah, you were like, how
was the
soon?
original plan. I mean, it was going to go well on into the 2000s. And so, yeah. And so we went all those years with
Yeah.
nothing. And then we're going to reboot the series, and we got Phantom Menace.
Yeah.
That was what you waited for all those years.
Exactly.
The Phantom Menace.
Exactly.
I have a movie one. I get more heartbroken with animals in movies, and I Am Legend and his dog.
I Am Legend. That was a great movie.
I watched it one time, and I saw him with his dog towards the end, and I cried, and I was like, I will never watch this movie again, and I've never watched that
That's
movie.
so-
And I've never watched the movie, and now I know I never will if there's
Yeah.
something with a dog that's
Yeah.
sad.
I just can't. There's it just got me, and I'm
Really?
like, I just can't do it. I can never do it, and it's like those mean more than human
Yeah.
deaths in
Yeah.
movies.
Yeah. That's what got you.
That's what got me. Yep.
Okay.
Got you.
That's what got me. So, all right, that's another week of Formed. We'll be back next Thursday.